This program is brought to you by PersonalLifeMedia.com. Living Dialogues is sponsored by Audible. Bestsellers in philosophy, spirituality, and self-help. Download your free audiobook from over 40,000 titles. Sign up for your risk-free trial at audiblepodcast.com/living. Join today. Cancel anytime in the first 2 weeks and keep your free book as your gift. You're going to love being an Audible listener.
From time immemorial, beginning with indigenous councils and ancient wisdom traditions, through the work of Western visionaries such as Plato, Galileo, and quantum physicist David Bohm, mutually participatory dialogue has been seen as the key to evolving and transforming consciousness, evoking a flow of meaning, a dia flow of logos, meaning, beyond what any one individual can bring through alone. So join us now, as together with you, the active deep listener, we evoke and engage in living dialogues. Welcome to Living Dialogues. I'm your host, Duncan Campbell, and with me for this particular dialogue, I'm truly delighted to have Joseph Chilton Pearce, author known to many of you for his works Crack in the Cosmic Egg, the national bestseller The Magical Child, Rediscovering Nature's Plan for Our Children, Evolution's End, and most recently, The Biology of Transcendence. For over 25 years, Joe has been acclaimed and featured internationally in his lectures on human development and the changing needs of children. So, Joseph Chilton Pearce, it's really a great delight to have you here in the studio.
Well, thank you, Duncan.
I think it might be very interesting to our audience to begin our dialogue here by perhaps reviewing very briefly the evolution of your own thinking and research, beginning with, over 25 years ago, your book, Crack in the Cosmic Egg, and then proceeding through The Magical Child, and a decade ago, Evolution's End. And we might then talk about the book, The Biology of Transcendence.
Well, I the other day pulled out my book, To Crack in the Cosmic Egg, and started looking at it because a publisher is going to bring it out for another edition. It was in print for 28 years, and so he's bringing it out again. I hadn't looked at the book in many a year, and I was really astonished to find that nearly everything I've been saying ever since is found in that book. Mm-hmm. I was kind of depressed because I thought, well, if I understood this much way back then, why haven't I acted it out a little bit better on the general scene? But the Magical Child, of course, came a number of years later, dealing specifically with children, and then Evolution's End, dealing with some of the real crises that we're facing with our children in this day and time. And my new book, The Biology of Transcendence, boils it all down to the bioculturalism, as it's called, the effect of culture on our biological system, mm-hmm. and the way our biological system then affects culture in turn.
And at one point, Joe, you mentioned a phrase that culture is the enemy of biology. And so let's talk about that theme of how culture actually, instead of nourishing, actually can impede the evolutionary spiral of human consciousness.
Well, I will say that in my short 76 years, I've heard one big theme over and over all my life, and that is reform. Everything has been in a process of reformation. Mm-hmm. We have to go down and clean up the mess in Washington. We must clean up the mess in the state capitol. We must reform our schools. We must reform medicine. We must reform this. Everything in a constant state of reformation. Culture survives only by our attempts to improve it. And it preserves itself or perpetuates itself by convincing us that we must improve culture at all cost. Mm-hmm. And the truth of the matter is culture cannot be improved. and it should never be sustained, but it's sustained by our attempts to make it work right. And every facet of contemporary life, leaving nothing out at all, every facet of life is simply an adjunct of culture. And culture is the enemy of the true biological nature of the human being.
At one point in our conversation earlier, you defined culture as a body of knowledge concerning physical survival in a hostile world based on fear, so that culture, in a sense, is a survival mechanism that's passed on by belief systems from generation to generation, and it is often then at odds with the transcending adaptive spiral of human consciousness, which is literally hardwired, if we will, into our biology. So perhaps we could ask you to comment on that.
Well, I know it's hardwired in, but you have to define your term transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
I'm basing my book and the definition of transcendence on the dictionary, which says simply, transcendence is the ability to rise above and go beyond limitation and constraint. Mm-hmm. Our inability to rise beyond and go beyond our current limitation and constraint leads us to all of our violence. We have in this life a choice between two things, either transcendence or violence, and there's nothing much in between. Mm-hmm. Culture depends on violence. Culture breeds violence, and culture thrives on violence. Gil Bailey, you might be familiar with Gil Bailey, who wrote a book called Violence Unveiled, Culture at the Humanity at the Crossroads. Mm-hmm. He was a follower of René Girard, the great French philosopher, who did his life study on the effect of culture and the way culture preserves itself through violence. And of course, all this is very anarchy. It's anarchistic. It's anti-cultural. To be anti-cultural is to be virtually anti to every single aspect of what we think of as civilization. But all of my books from the beginning on have really been dealing with culture, and I wasn't aware of it until the past few years. And that our natural biological system is designed to constantly evolve and rise above the limitations and constraints of our current state. Blocking this, you have only one reaction in the human being, and that is violence. So we either transcend or we start imploding and destroying ourselves.
And it's such a fascinating perspective, because what it does is give us a sense of how evolution proceeds. I'm thinking now of a book called Earth Household, published over 30 years ago by Gary Snyder, the American poet. And in a series of essays on what is happening to a larger ecological environment and its interface with human culture, he referred to the civilization establishment. Capital C, civilization, capital E, establishment. And what's being revealed, I think, in our dialogue here and in your work is that culture or civilization is always one step behind. It's consolidating that evolutionary step that has already been made and then trying to make a fortress or a home out of it to preserve some kind of stability or security against the inbuilt